Okay, so we are live now. So welcome everybody to our final session on Hegel and Dialetheism. And today what we're going to do is a bit different than normal. Instead of having somebody give a talk, we're going to have a discussion about one question. And the question is, why Hegel and Dialetheism? And all of the panelists and participants will have a chance to say a few words about this question, why Hegel and Dialetheism? And after we go around and everyone has said a few words about this, we'll open up the forum to questions from the panelists and also from YouTube. And so that's the plan for today. Graham, would you mind moderating during the question and answer period, at least for the panelists? Again, that's fine.
Sure.
Okay, and I'll keep an eye on the YouTube then. Graham, do you want to start us off today? Why Hegel and Dialetheism? Do you want to say a few words about that?
I'm happy to go in any order. I'm
right.
happy to start if you like.
Yeah, Graham, maybe you can start, and then Elena, and then I'll go, and then we'll go in line after that.
Okay.
Please, it's all yours, Graham.
This is a very vague question, but the aim was to keep it vague so that people will be able to address what really interests them about the topics we've been having. My interest is obviously whether Hegel was a dialethist and what role dialetheism played in his thought. Now, I think it's pretty obvious that Hegel was a dialethist. Given what he says, the places where he endorses explicit contradictions, and where he's coming from, his dependence on Kant, and what he says about his dependence on Kant and how he rings the changes, I think that's pretty obvious. So the main interest, I guess, is the role that dialetheism plays in the center point of his metaphysics, which is the dialectics. But that also is the locus, I think, of the main objection to the thought that Hegel was a dialetheist. So one can deal with those two things at the same time, which is what I'll do. Okay, so let's talk about how contradiction appears in the dialectic, in the logic. The dialectic goes through a various number of stages, but they occur in triples. At the first stage, you have a concept of some kind. In the second stage, you have a negation, and you have a contradiction between those two things. I don't think that's contentious. And in the third stage, that contradiction is aufgehoben. This is a dark term of Hegelian art. We'll have to think about it a little bit more in a moment. But a lot of people interpret the notion of aufheben as simply getting rid of. And then the argument against Hegel's dialetheism goes, well, since he thinks you've got to get rid of these things, he must be assuming the law of non-contradiction, so he's no dialethist. Okay, that's how the argument goes. But it sells Hegel short, because this word aufheben is not to get rid of, or not merely to get rid of. As, of course, I'm sure you all know, aufheben has almost a contradictory meaning. It means remove but preserve at the same time. So the contradictions are not merely removed, whatever that means, they're preserved. So you don't get rid of them. So this is not dependent on the law of non-contradiction, because the contradictions are not removed. So what is going on in this third moment of the dialectic? Well, clearly, at the third moment of the dialectic, a new concept emerges. And I don't think that that's contentious. I mean, the logic is a sequence of new concepts which emerge. The new concept, in some sense, expresses the contradiction that arose at the first two stages. And in a certain sense, it does so consistently. So just take the first phase of the dialectic. You've got the contradiction between being and nothing. The new concept is becoming, and then determinate being. And you can say that things are becoming or things have determinate being perfectly consistent. But that is because to become, for example, is to be and not to be in a certain sense. So the new concept expresses the contradiction, but it expresses it consistently. The new concept, therefore, in some sense, gets rid of the contradiction because it expresses the old situation consistently. To say that things are becoming is a consistent thing, at least until the next stage of the dialectic. But what it expresses is something that's inconsistent. That's the way that the contradiction is preserved. So in one sense, you get rid of the contradiction because you express it consistently with a new concept. But in one sense, you preserve the old contradiction because it's still there with the old concepts. Now, it's true that the new concept is in some sense better than the old concept. Let's come back to that in a minute. But it remains the case that the old concepts are still there and are still usable, in fact, used. If you read the logic, Hegel continues to employ the old concepts even after they've been aufgehoben. In fact, they must be, because the first concept is being. And how many times does Hegel use the word be after the first phase of the dialectic? You can't discuss philosophy without using those concepts. So those concepts are still present. In what sense is the new concept better? Well, I think it's because the new concept is richer and more adequate to express reality. So the old concepts, the earlier stages of the dialectic, are inadequate in a certain sense, in the sense of being not fully adequate, but they're still correct. Look, if I say Donald Trump is corrupt, that does not express the full complexity of the situation concerning him, but it's true enough. Okay. So the old concepts are perfectly good. They do describe reality, but they don't, their expressive capability is poverty-stricken in a certain sense. You need these richer concepts. So to summarize, the new concepts emerge in the dialectic. In some sense, they are better at expressing the richness of reality, but they don't remove the old concepts. The old concepts are perfectly fine concepts. Hegel continues to use them. They're contradictory, and they're just not as rich in describing reality as the concepts later in the progression. So that's my understanding of the role that contradiction plays in the dialectic. It serves as a motor to introduce a whole bunch of new concepts. In some sense, the new concepts are more adequate than the older concepts to express the richness of reality, but they're still there and they still describe reality. And in that sense, the contradictions are still present. And so what drives the dialectic is not the principle of non-contradiction. What drives the dialectic is precisely the production of better and better concepts to describe the richness of reality. Okay, that's my 10 cents worth, and I think I've come in under 5 minutes, certainly 7.
All right, thanks. Eleanor?
Okay, so I think that the question, why Hegel and dialetheism, includes at least 2 questions. The first one is dialetheism useful for Hegel? And the second one is Hegel useful for dialetheism? So I take now dialetheism first at a preliminary level as the position that uses some sort of paraconsistent logic and that holds that there are true contradictions. But now let's stick to this first preliminary account of dialetheism as a position that endorses some kind of paraconsistent logic. Then the question is, why is dialetheism so conceived useful for Hegel? And I think it is useful for more than the reasons I am telling you now, but what I'm interested in now is the following reason. The critique, so it is dialetheism as a kind, as the position that endorses some sort of paraconsistent logic, is useful for showing that Hegel's critique of formal logic is not anti-formal, and that the operation of Hegel in relation to logic, especially to logic in the sense of Verstandeslogik, which would be the Aristotelian logic of Hegel's times, the logic of understanding. So the operation of Hegel in relation to logic is not an operation of destruction, but of revision. And this can be shown very well by endorsing a dialethi's position, and which this would mean that Hegel has a non-classical approach to logic. And saying this, so saying Hegel was a non-classical logician, or Hegel's approach to logic was a non-classical approach to logic. Saying this does not mean to apply externally a category, the category of non-classical logic to Hegel, to Hegel thought in an external way and in an arbitrary way. Because, and this is what introduces my answer to the second question. So the point is that it is possible to argue for the view that Hegel and Hegelianism more generally was at the very origin of the birth of non-classical logics, was one of the roots of non-classical logics. So if we say dialethism as a paraconsistent or non-classical logic is useful for Hegel, because it lets us show that Hegel was a non-classical logician, then one has also to say, okay, and then this has a kind of necessary reason, because Hegel himself was at the very root of non-classical logic, or it can be argued for this view, and it was at the very root, especially of dialethism. If you want it or not. So in this sense, the second question would be, is Hegel useful for dialethism? And yes, it is. Hegel is useful for dialethism because Hegel is a root of dialethism, is at the very basis of the birth of dialethism. And so one can argue that the concept of dialethism is intrinsically connected to Hegelianism. Even if, independently. So for example, Graham sometimes says that they are autonomous, but in a way there is, so one can argue that there is a connection, that independently of the first, for example, idea of the logic of paradox was independent, was formulated independently from Hegel, but one can argue that the very historical field in which such an idea was born was deeply entrenched with Hegelianism. But the point is, so examining the origin or the roots or the prehistory of dialetheism in Hegel's dialectics is useful for dialetheism, for the comprehension of dialetheism and of the comprehension of the concept of dialetheism on the basis of the principle that the history of concepts is not a kind of secondary occupation. It doesn't consist of not speaking about the things, but speaking about the instruments we use when we talk about things. Rather, the idea of the Begriffsgeschichte contains a critical element in the view about our use of concepts. The idea of Begriffsgeschichte, the history of concepts, tells us that the language of the concept cannot be changed and used and put aside in an arbitrary way, but it is born from the element in which we move ourselves, in which we move while we think. So, these are the two aspects that, according to me, and in this very specific moment, are very interesting for me. So, on the one side, showing that dialetheism is super useful in order to illuminate one specific aspect, which means Hegel's approach to logic. What is it? Is it anti-logical, or is it, or it encompasses logic also in a formal technical meaning of the word? And the second point is Hegel is useful for dialetheism from the point of view of the history of concepts. So I think I've spoken enough.
Okay, thank you, Elena. And now I guess I will say a few words myself, and then we'll go on to the final four panelists. Okay, so why Hegel and dialetheism? Well, I think this is a very timely question. As in the past couple of years, we've seen some books published that advocate for this, for a dialethic reading of Hegel, such as Elena's book, The Form of Truth. And so one, it's a very timely question for Hegel scholars. However, it's also a really important systematic question as well as historical one. And I briefly just want to say a few words about this. And in particular, I want to focus on the concept of the absolute and of absolute thinking, which is important for my approach in my reading of Hegel. So I think Hegel is really primarily concerned with thinking through what the absolute is. And I think for Hegel, whenever you attempt to think through what the absolute is, you always land in contradiction, and it's inevitable, inescapable. The absolute understood as something like an unconditioned universality. This unconditioned universality is all-encompassing, it excludes nothing, it's not relative to anything. And so we have this particular problem. The absolute is absolute, it is not relative to anything. So it seems, of course, to the naive reader that the absolute would be other than the relative, opposed to it, distinct from it. But it turns out that if it were that way, then it would not be absolute. So the only way the absolute could be absolute is if it is relative or not absolute. And so this is the basic idea. To think what is absolute is to think what is absolute and not absolute. To think the absolute is to think a contradiction. And so I think Hegel's view is more or less that inevitably thinking the absolute leads to contradiction. So that the absolute can only be true to itself, can only be what it is if it is what it is not, right? So it's true to itself in not being what it is. Okay, and so this is why I think there is a risk when we overestimate the Kantian or Aristotelian frameworks through which we read Hegel. And it's better for us not to somehow evade the contradiction by modeling our thinking on someone who we do understand, right? So I think this is just an important qualification. Now, Hegel, many philosophers, I would say some, would say, well, wait, the absolute is contradictory, let's get rid of it. So there isn't such a thing as the absolute. There isn't such a thing as and other people use terms like set of all sets or world. But Hegel says, no, the absolute is real, and it is a real contradiction, right? So Hegel doesn't deny the truth of the whole. Rather, as we know, the true is the whole. The true is the whole, and that is articulated as a contradiction. So I think the challenge, one of the big challenges of Hegel's philosophy, is to challenge us to think the absolute, but not to fall into contradiction. That's the challenge. Can you think it and not contradict yourself? And I think that's impossible. I would put that to all the panelists and to anyone watching and to posterity, right? Can you think the absolute without falling into contradiction? And I don't think you can. And this is why Hegel says about the contradiction, it is der absolute Widerspruch. It's the absolute contradiction. It's not the merely relative one, but der absolute Widerspruch, right? The absolute contradiction. So Hegel has this concept of absolute determinacy. What is the absolute? It's not just indeterminate. It's not just that it has no character. It's not relatively determinate. It's not determinate in relation to something else, but it is absolutely determinate. And so then the question arises, how else could you describe this absolute determination, except as self-contradictory, right? Because the determinate has this negative relation to what is other to itself, but the absolute has nothing that is outside of it. So the only other that the absolute can have is itself. The only thing that it can stand in this negative relation to is itself. And so it seems to me that if we want to articulate what the absolute determinacy is of the absolute, this requires appealing to contradiction. Now, of course, as Graham already said, contradiction may not be, he didn't exactly say this, but we have this notion of the Aufhebung. Contradiction may not be sufficient for the full articulation of what the absolute is. And indeed, contradiction is canceled. So it's not sufficient to say the absolute is contradictory as though that were enough, but rather it's preserved. It's preserved as a necessary feature of what the absolute is. So many of the questions that have come up in our dialogue is the following. Well, what is the character of that contradiction in Hegel? And what is the kind of thing that is contradictory? And that's a huge discourse. We didn't finish that. We have to keep talking about it and writing about it. But one thing that is true is that the contradiction, it seems, is self-contradiction. The absolute is in self-contradiction. It is absolute and not absolute. Whatever else it is that. And what is it that's in self-contradiction? Most minimally, it is the absolute. It is that which is all-encompassing. Now that, I think, for Hegel is not just conceptual, but as we know, if it's going to be all-encompassing, it'll include nature and spirit and the like. So we have this absolute totality that is in contradiction with itself. Whatever else is true, I think that is true. Whatever else is true, I think that is true. There's a lot more I can say. I want to be done within 7 minutes here. Really briefly, it is the case, I think, that for Hegel, the truth of this contradiction isn't established by a finite mind comparing concepts to objects. But I think Hegel, he really has this idea that that absolute thinking establishes its truth autonomously or on its own. That is, that it ought to be an unconditioned principle, right? If its truth depends on something outside itself, it's not absolute, it's conditioned, it's relative, right? So whatever truth the absolute has, it has to have it in virtue of itself, right? That's another dimension of, I think, the truth of absolute contradiction in Hegel. And finally, I think there's a big risk when we admit that the absolute is inevitably contradictory. One of the big, I think, sources of anxiety that people have is that the absolute becomes indeterminate, or people are worried that everything will just disappear into the night when all cows are black or something, or pure chaos. But I think the beauty of Hegel is he's really challenging us, maybe also in the spirit of Elena's comments, to rethink logic in a non-classical way, such that contradiction and the truth of the absolute can be accommodated. And I think that if we marginalize dialetheism, we're also marginalizing the vocation of philosophy, which I really hold in the Hegelian sense that the vocation of philosophy is to think the whole, to think the truth of the whole, the absolute, and that inevitably leads to contradiction. So as we marginalize dialetheism, we marginalize the vocation of philosophy. And so I think to reassert the vocation of philosophy is to place dialetheism in the center of the discourse. And so for me, why Hegel and dialetheism is is not just about Hegel, but about the vocation of philosophy itself. Okay, sorry, I went 7 minutes and 30 seconds. My apologies. Okay, on to the next person. We're missing Alex, so we have a little bit of a buffer here. I hope Alex does show up, so we'll be late. But Michaela, maybe you could say a few words.
Okay. Since it is our last meeting, I will be a little sentimental today. I will not say why dialectic and dialetheism is relevant in general. I will say a couple of things about why it is relevant for me. And I will try to do that by quoting a Yoruba story of the Candomblé religion. Candomblé is a religion that is quite common in Brazil. It is a religion that comes from certain parts of Africa. And I want to tell a story about Eshu. Eshu is a sacred entity in this Yoruba religion. And recently, I started to become interested in this, in Eshu. I started to read and research about Eshu. And I realized that Eshu is an explicitly contradictory figure of divine, of human, and it is always involved in contradictory situation. And this for me was particularly interesting because Eshu is a figure whose contradiction is not a synonymous of a moment of a blockage, of a disease of thought and life. The contradictory and paradoxical character of Eshu is an element that starts from a moment of radical crisis to lead to an opening new path, a new horizon for thinking and living the concrete reality of things. And I want to tell you this story, which is the story of Eshu that takes two friends to fight to death. And the story goes like this. Two friendly peasants started working in their field very early, but both stopped praising Eshu. Eshu, who had always given them rain and good harvests. Eshu was furious, wearing a pointed cap, on one side white, on the other side red. Eshu walked on the border of the fields with one on his right and the other on his left. He passed between the two friends and greeted them emphatically. The peasants looked at each other. Who was the stranger? Who is the stranger in a white cap? Asked one. Who is the stranger in the red cap? Asked the other. The cap was white, said one. No, the cap was red, said the other. White, red, white, red. They began to argue about the color of the cap. White, red, white, red. They ended up fighting with whole blows, killing each other. Eshu sang and danced. Eshu was avenged. So Eshu, among the Orisha, these sacred entities of this religion, has the role of mediator. He's a messenger between human beings and the divine. Eshu reigns at the crossroad, the limits, at the points where different paths meet but always separates. And he's not a peaceful protector of crossroads and of limits. He's someone who awakens the energy of crossroads and limits. So Eshu forces us to think differently about limits, borders, crossroads, barriers, and that limits that constitute us and our lives. And with Eshu, an experience of limits and border comes into play, and it is an experience that, far from being a point of separation that closes the door to what is other, is an experience that is a starting point in which new paths for the experience of otherness are opened. In the story I quoted, Eshu walks on the border of the field, working on the border between the two friends who stopped praising him. The two friends do not recognize him. It recognizes Eshu. Each one is trapped in a kind of delimited, finite reality that is a reality where neither can understand the other friend as well as the foreign, which is Eshu. They do not understand what is beyond the limit, just as they do not understand the limit itself. So Eshu is certainly a critical figure, is the figure that leads to the destruction of the limited and finite reality of the two friends. But Eshu leads to destruction, he leads to a negation that does not end up in a peaceful result, in a peaceful reconciliation. The destruction and the negation of Eshu results in a dance and in a song that feeds itself of this same destruction, of this negation. That is a destruction and a negation in which Yeshua finds its full energy, his power and his movement. The path opened by Yeshua are built from destruction, crisis, death. They are paths that unfolds from awakening a radical negativity of the limits that already refer in itself to its own overcoming, to the overcoming of this limit. And I think that the philosophical proposal of Hegel and of Priest, in this philosophical proposal, this is something like the spirit of Yeshua. What I want to say is that there are philosophical proposals that present us with a thought which is always thinking of its limit in order to go beyond its own limits. This is a kind of thought I think that we still need today, maybe because it is a radical thought of negation. And for me, the end of 2021 between Hegel and Brazil, it is also, I think, a thought that can help us to think about this time of crisis. And that's my comment.
Thanks a lot, Michaela. That was really nice. So it seems like Franca has had to go to a meeting, but I have her comments she sent to me in advance. So how about maybe we let Stefan, maybe you could go ahead and say a few words, and then I'll prepare Franca's, and then I can read them after you. Is it okay? Okay. All right. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you. I'm afraid I'm a little bit the heretic in here, because I don't believe that Hegel is a dialetheist. So for the following reasons. So I think other than the logic of paradox, speculative logic of Hegel is not a different system of logic or calculus compared to common formal logic, but is common logic reflected in itself and has their right to become conscious of its own presuppositions. Hegel's higher logic is not an alternative to common formal logic, but explicates its implicit presuppositions. So I think this is an important difference. And Hegel does not dismiss the universal validity of the law of identity and non-contradictions, but tries to speculative reconstruct and revise their true meaning. He does not claim to annihilate common logic thus, but to apprehend and thereby substantiate it. And I think the difference can be seen, if I may quote from Graham's essay, Classical Logic Aufgehoben. He says, the logical paradoxes are precisely what they appear to be, sound arguments showing that something is both true and false. And Hegel wouldn't say that contradictions are, at least this is what I think, are what they appear to be, but contradictions have to be resolved within logical thought. And of course, Graham Priest is right that this does not mean to simply get rid of the contradiction, but I think it's a radicalization of the law of non-contradiction, because Hegel thinks in his logic of reflection that, or he shows there that the determination of contradiction has in itself the logical resources for the resolution of contradiction and the sublation of all contradiction into their grounds. So it is just the result of the reflection of abstract identity, and it's just an intermediate phase of the reflection of abstract identity into itself, of a determination of thought. And then it's resulting in its ground as the absolute and concrete identity reflected into itself. So an abstract determination of thought is not what it really is, and so, thus it is contradictory in itself, but this contradiction in itself has the resources to solve the contradiction and in a way create or establish the true identity of this thought determination. So the eventual end of logic for Hegel is the comprehension of logical methodology, which is at the same time, I think, the solution of all contradictions in logic, namely the methodology to resolve contradictions. So for Hegel, there can be no true contradictions. Contradictions might be correct, but they can never be true, since a contradictory state of affairs is unstable and has to make way for a state of affairs in which the contradiction is dissolved. So Hegel really radicalizes the law of non-contradiction. But now comes the but. I don't want to be just an heretic. Whereas Hegel's speculative philosophy is distinct from dialetheism, I think they are nevertheless joined in a common intellectual project, namely to get both to the bottom and to the limit of human thought itself. According to many philosophers, the laws of identity and contradiction are supposed to be the most fundamental laws of cognition and logic. But because of their fundamentally, one has to accept them immediately and cannot give reasons for them without already operationally presupposing them. So this can be seen in a letter that David Lewis, I think, once said to Graham Priest and a colleague of him, that he, in a way, refuses or declines to participate in an argument about the law of non-contradiction. And I think that Hegel and Graham Priest both think that it would be kind of strange if the law of non-contradiction or contradiction is such a fundamental principle for reason and logic that it itself must be left unfounded and without any reason. So I think both Priest and Hegel think that you must give a reason for it if you think that the law of non-contradiction really holds in each situation, or that it's really a true principle of thought. So I think this is a common project, and I think they share it with other authors such as Nikolaus of Kues or Meister Eckhart and the Romantics, Fichte. But I think what is more, or if we accept this common ground, then the question how they differ in their approach to this project, I think this is much more interesting than just stating that they have something in common. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Stefan, and I appreciate your courage to be heretical in the group. And we've had other heretics among us, but they haven't appeared for the last discussion. So thank you for coming and voicing your views. Very well thought out and argued. Let me. Do you mind if I read what Franca sent me? Is okay. I mean, it's from her presentation, but she explicitly addressed the question in her presentation. So I thought it might be nice just to read what to remind us if we've forgotten. So a couple weeks ago, and then we'll go on to Toby. We'll have the last word here. Okay. So first, why Hegel? Franca says, my answer briefly is this, because if we want to have clear ideas about what philosophy is, what its subject matters, methods, aims are, we need to refer to some version of Hegelianism. In practice, Hegelianism is, quote, the only meta-philosophy that matters, close quote. There are reasons to believe that Hegel has given the most accurate account of the nature of philosophy as a particular science. No other thinker has justified and explained in equally deep a way the use of philosophy in the age of science in modern times. Unfortunately, Hegel's meta-philosophy has been underrated or ignored, especially by interpreters in the analytic tradition. Second, why dialetheism? Because dialetheism is the only view in philosophical logic which is engaged in the study of true contradictions and elaborates on the possibility or even necessity of true contradictions, TC, for some sense of T and C. The necessity of true contradiction is the reason there is a science or discipline called philosophy without specification. As Hegel teaches us, true contradictions are the subject matter of philosophy. They inform the method of philosophical working reasoning, and their occurrence defines the aim of this special first science. Third, why Hegel and dialetheism? Hegel is an almost unworkable thinker for our standards, 215 years from his birth. His style of philosophizing is not our style. His concept of logic is not exactly our conception. I would not say why Hegel and dialetheism, but why some form of Hegelianism and dialetheism? We should rethink and update Hegel. Hence, or H, Hegelianism. You should rethink and update Hegelianism. Hence, the answer to the question is simple, because Hegelianism and dialetheism is the only philosophy that matters. For other details, see if you have time. She has an old paper from 2001 about the role of logic in the analytic continental divide, published in the International Journal of Philosophical Studies. So I think that's everything. So she was coming in under 5 minutes. Okay. And then finally, Toby, you have the last 7 minutes. It's all yours.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to share some slides that I have, because I'd like to start with my remarks on that very good question on the relation of dialectism and Hegel by giving you a little quotation, which is to be found in the introduction of the subjective logics. And this is where Hegel gives sorts of an retrospective overview of what has been happening beforehand. So I quote that hence the objective logic, which treats of being in essence, constitutes in truth, the genetic exposition. And this is a very literal translation by Di Giovanni. In German, it reads as genetische Exposition. So this is the genetic exposition of the concept. More precisely, he says, substance already is real essence, or essence insofar as it is united with being and has stepped into actuality. Consequently, the concept has substance for its immediate preposition. Substance is implicitly what the concept is explicitly. The dialectical movement of substance through causality and reciprocal affection, which is translated by, or this is the translation of Wechselwirkung, is thus the immediate genesis of the concept by virtue of which its becoming is displayed. And I think this is a crucial remark on method. And I think the very idea of questioning, of this question on how the relation is to be understood of dialectism and Hegel brings us to this very core matter of philosophy. So I'm all with what Franka just said about the idea of meta-philosophy. And I think as a starting point, we can say that it is rather uncontroversial that Hegel himself recognized his own indebtedness of his own entire project to the history of thought. So we don't start from the scratch. We always have to work with textual body. And I think this is rather uncontroversial that this is Hegel's point of view. So I'd like to propose now to understand Hegel's notion of genetic exposition as a model of immanent critique. And I do deliberatively use immanent critique as a proper term. Yeah, so this is the very method of critical thinking, which is often attributed with Hegel, mostly with Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. So this became the notion to capture the method he's applying. So by virtue of immanent critique, we make explicit what is implicit in or while rationalizing the immediate prepositions of subjectivity. In this, I would call this a hermeneutical praxis. We change the substance of the concept. So this is to say that all thinking is historically situated, but not historically determined. So this is a crucial difference. We are situated, but not determined by the prepositions of our own subjectivity. And so in engaging in the critique of our prepositions, we change our own subjectivity and substance. So this is what I think, what is the crucial importance of Hegelian philosophy, that it's not only about in philosophy to think the truth, but also to move the truth by thinking. And this is what we do when we engage in critical thinking. And this brings me to my second slide, because this has at least 3 implications which I like to spell out. Because the idea of immanent critique as a model of hermeneutical practice has implications. And I think the first one is that all reconstruction is interpretive appropriation of the textual body. I have in brackets here that is about philosophical reconstruction. I think it is extendable. You will have the same motive, so to speak, in place when it comes to the question on religion and aesthetics. So even in art and religion, we have the same logics of reconstruction to be appropriation. So this is to say that in interpreting our roots, interpreting our where we come from, the presuppositions of subjectivity, which is substance, we kind of inscribe ourselves in the tradition and contribute to its further determination or its further actualization. So this is the first step. I think this is something very close to what I find in Gadamer. So in Gadamer, there is this prominent concept of what is known in German as Wirkungsgeschichte, could be translated as the principle of history of effect. So that the effect of the source, it's part of the very reality or actuality of the source. So it's not a two-staged process, because interpretation is actualization. So the own history is part of the actuality of the source. And this is different from, I find, in Derrida, because I think Derrida is also applying some sort of hermeneutics, but it's rather a deconstructive sort. And what I find very helpful in Gadamer, in order to express the core of Hegelian hermeneutics, is that we have to subordinate ourselves to the text's claim in order to, or the text's claim to dominate our mind. So this is what I find in Gadamer's Truth and Method. So there is a certain idea of intellectual bondage. So we have to submit ourselves to the authority of the text, but this is not just sort of an following or just a sort of unfree engagement. It's rather the opposite. It's through this very idea of submission that we reach a level of freedom. So the subjectivity sets itself free, so through submitting to the authority of the text. And this is not what I find in Gadamer. This is not what I find in Derrida. Derrida is pretty much the opposite, because in Derrida it's more about the idea of decentering the center or centralizing the margins, but it's not the idea of submitting to the authority of the text. But I think this is a very crucial idea in Hegel, which is like on the very formal level, analyzed in the dialectics of which we find in the phenomenology of spirit. So master and slave. So I just apply this idea of master and slave to the question of what hermeneutics is. So this leads me to my last conclusion, which is to say that the idea of systematic validity, or in German we have this as Geltung, of categorical concepts is only or is actualized through critical appropriation of its genesis. So Geltung und Genese, which is kind of an opposition in most philosophies, are reconciled in Hegel by saying that there is no such a thing as conceptual normativity per se. So all conceptual validity is only in place or intact through the very idea of actualizing it. So this is what he has on this slide before, when he says about the genetic exposition. So it's an appropriation of the substance, and this is how we kind of move the concept. And I think this is extremely important when it comes to understand what philosophy is. And I think this is the entire picture, and within which we can place the relevance of dialectism, because I think it's very clear that the actualization of the categorical concepts of classical logic that we find in Hegel's science of logic is nothing else than the genetic exposition and radicalizing the uninformative character of the law of identity and the law of non-contradiction. We have to leave them behind in order to actualize the validity of the concept. And I think this is extremely helpful, what we can find here in Hegel. And this is my contribution to that very question on the relevance on Hegel and dialectism. Thanks.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Toby. So, Graham, like you said, if you don't mind moderating questions from the panelists, then I'll hand it over to you. It looks like there's no one posting any questions yet on YouTube, so it may just be a conversation between us.
Okay.
Hey, let's see what happens, I know our Throngs fans will be asking questions soon.
So this is meant to be a free-flowing discussion. Let's try this. There's only a few of us. So instead of my sort of bringing speakers in, if you want to say something, why don't you just jump in? If it becomes chaotic, I'll resolve the tangle. But in the hope of having a free-flowing discussion, let's try and do this as we would in a seminar room. So who'd like to make the first question or comment or thought? Greg.
Yeah, I jotted down a few questions that I have, but I'll just start with one, and then we'll see if there's time to talk about the others or if people are interested. Michaela, I wanted to ask you about the the story you told and the images that it evokes. I mean, there's really there's a lot of violence in the story, it seems, right? So people are killing each other. And so that, one thing that I'm interested in is this question about Hegel and violence. We haven't spoken about this much, but I am curious about Hegel and violence, and like, to what extent is the dialectical thinking and the kind of contradictory nature of Hegel's thought, to what extent does it lead to and endorse violence? I mean, there's these other ideas about the concept being true blessedness and true love, right? So there's this other story. And I'm also curious, why not talk about like Christianity? Or like, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, because Christianity also seems to really embody the spirit of Hegel's thinking in another sense. You know, here we are approaching Christmas, that the infinite becomes finite, right? In a person, there's a kind of unity of the universal and the particular, a kind of infinitude that is transcendent and immanent. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts about this, violence and love, and are they somehow together, and how does that work? I mean, it's kind of a strange combination. So
thank you for the question. It's a really interesting question, and I didn't thought about this problem with violence, but
yeah,
there is this part, this element of I wouldn't call it violence, but it's the radicality of negation in certain passages in the logic. For example, I was thinking now about the dialectic of finity, of the finite and infinity. When Hegel mentioned that part, he mentioned death, he mentions pain, okay? And we cannot avoid to admit that this is extremely violent with respect to our finitude. And the problem is with the story that seems that the violence is caused by Yeshua, and that this is nothing to deal with the two friends. But actually that violence is caused by the fact that the two friends forget to praise Yeshua, which is something like necessary for the things to work in the Yoruba community. So it is as if they undermine themselves. In a certain way, Yeshua does nothing but make explicit the finitude of the two characters of the story. And I think that this is what dialectic does. And in a certain way, this is the same that there is a similar spirit. I took a similar spirit in the work of Graham, because the problem is that to underline the finite character of the certain philosophical positions. For me, that's the interesting part, and it is done through an immanent critic.
Yeah.
Of course, the story I told uses representation, so the immanence of the critic is not so clear. But if one knows what the shoe does, what the shoe represents, it is like something that makes explicit our limits. And when you learn to understand or to feel these limits, new paths are open. This is something that from a religious perspective, from a philosophical perspective, from an existential perspective, I think that is extremely important for us. Of course, now we are talking about philosophy, but this was the violent part, the violent part that I see in dialectic, the radicality of the negation. And we see this also in a Christian religion, of course. I think that what we meet in the mystery of incarnation and resurrection is exactly something that is extremely violent. It is God that is dying. And we cannot take account for, we cannot explain this without using, from a logical point of view, without using a contradiction, I think.
Yeah, because it's, on the one hand, it's the death of finitude, right? But then there's also the death of death itself, which is part of the, the Christian narrative of the dying of death. It's a way of, pictorially, or I don't know, it's a way of the story of death and resurrection is a way of, pictorially representing the negation of negation, the dying of death. And so then there's also like this image of the, where one could also think about the death of finitude also as the, I guess in the Christian mystical tradition, this idea of theosis or deification or infinitization of the finite being. There's a whole tradition somehow of this becoming deified of something that is human. Anyway, I don't know, just some other thoughts on some pictorial religious ways.
There is a note chapter of Greg's book about this.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
I want to ask a question to Elena about the word you use, considering the relation between dialectic and dialetheism and Hegel's dialectic and logic in general. You use the term revision. I was wondering, isn't that word, the revision, too weak to say what Hegel does in the logic? Because Hegel talks about a logical form, of course, but he talks about an absolute logical form, which is a form which produces its own content, which is something that I cannot really meet in anything I know about formal logic.
Yes, I was using it and I was wondering myself if it is the right word while I was using it. But so the point is that the discussions in the dialectic literature about logic revision are illuminating in shaping an approach to logic and that is very close to the Hegelian one. Now, the point is, what does Hegel do with the intellectual logic or Verstandeslogik? And Stefan said it is actually what Hegel does is so Hegel's logic or Hegel's speculative logic, or we can also call it Vernunftlogik, is a reflection about intellectual logic or common logic, right, Stefan? It's a kind of apprehension and a kind of substantiation of Verstandeslogik. So the point is it logic revision? Do we have a revision of logic in Hegel's view? And what does revision or revising logic mean? Well, I think the point is what does revision, logic revision mean? It means that so there is so the point is the relationship between logic and natural language, and so in Hegel you have these the idea of natural logic, Verstandeslogik, Vernunftlogik. And then you have the first idea is the idea that Verstandeslogik is a kind of logic, also called the Logik als Theorie, logic as theory, is what Aristotle does in his analytics. So Aristotle examines the forms of thought in natural language. He examines natural language and then he fixes some forms that are the forms of valid reasoning, and that are the syllogistic forms. And so we have logic as theory. And according to Hegel, this is absolutely crucial, is a absolutely important operation. But evidently there is the famous point. So for Hegel, the point is, okay, are we really sure that the forms fixed by logic as theory are forms of true thought? In some cases, these forms of valid thinking are not forms of truth. And here, this kind of question is the question carried on by the dialectical approach, the speculative approach to logic. And my point is, so what I think is important to stress is that Vernunftlogik cannot be understood as an alternative to Verstandeslogik. So it encompasses, it's a kind, is not, so it's not an alternative logic. It is an operation of reflecting upon the forms fixed by Verstandeslogik, and an operation of individuating other forms. And those forms are, in some cases,
Hello.
So they are bearers of a revision of the old forms. A revision in the sense of a critique of the old forms. So in that sense, is a logic revision. I don't know. Perhaps I wasn't clear enough in my explanation. So I see this interplay between Verstandeslogik, Vernunftlogik, natural logic as an interplay that can be spelled out in terms of logic revision, of what is now, or what Graham, for example, calls the revision of logic, but also Richard Routley in his texts about logic and theory choice does. So what this is so it is very, very close. But so perhaps I'm wrong, I don't know.
No, I completely agree with what you said. I just the only thing I'm not convinced is that I wouldn't use the term revision just because the fact that the valid form of reasoning are not form of true, and you need the dialectical thinking reflecting on a category which are sedimented in natural language. This is a lot. It is a lot of work that we need to do. I would rather use the term radical transformation, because if it is just a revision, I would say that for my understanding of this expression, I would say that then we should admit that the logic is formalizable. I don't know if I'm inventing a new word. Can we formalize the logic if a dialectical logic is just an alternative of classical and non-classical, other non-classical logics? If it is a revision, I think we should be able to formalize it, but I don't think we can formalize it. Would you agree?
So the idea is can we formalize the process of reflection upon the forms of thought? Can we? Yeah, well, why not? We can formalize everything, according to me. The point is how you do that. Why not? So formalizing means using a language in order to explain another language, and we do that all the time while we talk with each other. well, but the point is, perhaps if you understand by formalizing, you understand giving us semantics so I don't know, so a model theory or a proof theory. So the point is, what kind of form can we use? But in principle, why not? And then, but also, so the point, what I think it's important is also to use, because if you say logic transformation, then it is not so evident what is the relevance of Hegel's logic for logicians today. So I think, so I think it's important to communicate. And so using revision, I think it's a good way to communicate, also in a critical way. Because you could say, okay, let's look at what happens in the literature, in the philosophical logic, under the label the revision of logic, and then you see, then you know where to look for. So and then you can think, okay, well, in this sense we can say it is an operational logic revision, in this other sense not. But you need to know the words to use the word that we use now. We cannot, right? But in order to communicate with each other, if we want to communicate with Graham as well, and not among Hegelians. but probably I don't.
Stefan's been waiting to get in for a while, so
okay. Thank you. So, Elena, you said Hegel is reflecting upon Verstandes logic of understanding. But this sounds a little bit like it's a meta logic. But Hegel says I would say that he reflects Verstandes logic into itself, which means, or I think what Hegel thinks is that Verstandes logic means more than it says. So it says something like A is A, or identity is identity. And what Hegel does is, okay, if you say identity is identity, you say more than just identity is identity. You also say, oh yes, identity is not difference, or it's the exact opposite of difference. But so, and then comes the next step. So, okay, now you see that what you say is in contradiction to what you mean, because now you mean that identity is something different. And now it is something different, and identity are external to each other, which he calls external reflection in the logic of reflection. But then in the next step, he shows, oh yes, but if we think this thought further, or if we reflect it into itself, then we see that difference is not opposed to identity, but in truth, it's a momentum of identity. And then what the logic of understanding that says that identity is identity, now it has become true, because now it is not, as for example, Fichte thinks, you always need something different to make a thought explicit or make a thought determination explicit. You just have to reflect it into itself. So you don't need the opposed notion, but the opposite notion is a moment of the notion itself. So I wouldn't say that, or to reflect upon sounds a little bit like a hierarchical spheres. And I think this is not what Hegel would say, that his logic is some kind of meta logic to the logic of understanding. And if I may ask a question to Toby, because the idea of violence is very interesting for the idea of interpretation, I think, because I always thought that Heidegger, his interpretation seemed to be violent to the text he is really interpreting. And in a way, you could say that authors such as Meister Eckhart, when he interprets things from the New Testament, you think the nuns must have, I don't know, gone out of their mind. And the same with Hegel. I don't think that Descartes would say, oh yes, this is exactly what I meant. And both Hegel and I think Eckhart too would say, yes, but this is what you truly mean. So I think, and this is a difference to Gadamer, I think, we are not subject to tradition, but we are subject to truth, and truth comes to us by tradition in a way. So no one can transcend the spirit of his ages. But I think that this is what he always says, that he brings Descartes, for example, into Descartes' truth, and in doing so into das eigene of Descartes, so the very own, so what he truly meant. So I would think that there is really a strong, or really a big difference between Hegel and Gadamer. Gadamer is much more into this whole tradition thing, and I think even much more conservative in a way. And of course, Gadamer, I think, was highly influenced by Schleiermacher. And as far as I can see, Hegel was not always very fond, and the idealists were not very fond of Schleiermacher. I mean, Schelling, in his Epikureisch Glaubensbekenntnis of Heinz Wiederporsten, he makes this awful jokes about Schleiermacher, and I think they didn't really appreciate his philosophy. So even historically, it seems a little bit difficult to say, okay, and now we explain Gadamer by Hegel, by Gadamer. This seems kind of a little bit strange, but this violence and interpretation, if you have some thoughts about it, I would be interested in.
Yes, thanks. This is extremely helpful. It's a very good question, because I do agree that Hegel's approach, as you mentioned, of Descartes is trying to bring to the fore the inner motive of Descartes and knowing better what Descartes had in mind than Descartes himself. So I think this isn't kind of a violent act. And so what I was trying to show with this relevant, or with relation to Gadamer and Derrida, that I think my major claim was that the idea of actualizing categories is a hermeneutical practice. And this is what we do, or this is how we kind of transform the subject. And this brings me also to this debate on revision or transformation. For me, it's rather clear that it is transformation. And it's not a new concept that arises out of a contradiction, but it's a transformed concept. But how do we bring about this transformation? And this is what I was trying to reach at by saying that this is sort of an intellectual bondage. So it's kind of, we submit our standing to the tradition, because we cannot just come from, let's say, a sovereign point of view, an external point of view, and just simply judge on the validity or the truth of philosophical texts, but we have to see them in their own context. And we can only see better what they mean by subordinating us to this idea of the dominant, the truth in the texts. And I think this is what Gadamer has in mind. So I have a certain different reading of Gadamer. For me, Gadamer is less conservative that many people think of him to be, because the idea of application as part of what it means to be reconstructing texts, I see this at the very core in Gadamer. So, but this might lead then to a discussion on how to interpret Gadamer. It's just that you should read ideas that apply a certain technique, but it's not out of sovereignty, but it's an indebtedness to the source, that we can see better what the source was aiming at. But you have a direct response to this.
Yeah, just one thing, perhaps you should once read his, he gave I think it was a talk or it was a paper on Herder during the Nazi time. And there you can see that it is kind of politically conservative. So I would say that don't care about the Nazi thing right now, but you can see how conservative his theory is. And I think he's not as interested in this idea of freedom, which for Hegel is the absolute itself. More like freedom of play with Schiller, perhaps, or something like this. But I don't think that he's a philosopher of freedom. I don't believe
it's true. There should be much more shall be said on Gadamer. He is a complex figure. It's true. It's just that I like this idea of the intellectual bondage that we have to do justice to when we do what we do in philosophy. So this is kind of, it's not that we start from the scratch. So it's on shoulders of giants that we stand, and only on these shoulders we are able to see backwards and see better where we are. And I think this is an insight that I like a lot. And plus, but this brings me also to this idea, and this goes back to Michaela and also Elena's idea on the Aufhebung and reconciliation, which is, I think, very important in Hegel, because also this question, the entire question on the infinitization of the subjective spirit, I think, because this is extremely important for me, is to see that if we think of the absolute to be dependent or relative, I think it's not that we kind of just project onto the world what we think of the world to be. It's more that we have to negate ourselves. So in a self-negation, we transform the totality. And I think this is on Christian terms, it's recognition or reconciliation. So how do we make the God appear? By reconciling, by bringing peace. So I mean, it's a bit kitschy to put it that way, but peace and love. But peace and love as a sort of self-negation. And I think this is extremely interesting, because this is not this idea of the subjective spirit to be sovereign and kind of bring out and project the world, project onto the world its own normativity, but it's more sort of like in taking back on the own ego. And I think this is also what happens when it comes to the logic. So as analysis, it is kind of aufgehoben in the speculative motion, but it's just one step. So I think it's also helpful to rephrase the dialectical process, not with these terms of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. These are deeply Kantian terms, but more like we start with an analysis, then we go on to synthesis, and we end with sort of a dialectical sort of self-critique, because we question our schemata. So this is wherever we go, we see this kind of idea of self-negation as a true form of contribution to this transformation of the whole. And yeah,
I mean, the idea of self-negation is really key in learning to follow the thinking of Hegel, that you in a way negate or quiet your own thoughts so you can think the thought of thought. I think that's even the practice of reading Hegel requires a practice in a way of letting oneself go. I mean,
but see how this can be extremely violent for the way in which we are used to think. Okay, because there is this part of the beginning of the logic where it just says that thought categories are not our instruments.
Yes, exactly.
But we are the instruments of thought categories of our thought. Exactly. But to try to understand how this works, it is, and we know how violent can be for the normal way in which we are used to think. And this is another incompatibility this is another point that make me think that it is difficult to formalize the logic, because when we are talking about formal logic, as far as I know, but you can tell me I'm wrong, as far as I know, when we are talking about formal logic, we are talking about some formal category that we use as instrument to give an account of something else. If there is another way to think of formal logic which can be compatible with this way of conceiving of thought, where thought is not our instruments, but we are in a certain way instrument of thought, I would like to know if this can be compatible with formal logic. I don't see any way in which this can be compatible with formal logic. Oh no, I'm wrong. I don't want to say that it is incompatible. I want to say that this way of thinking of thought is not reducible to formal logic, because of course Hegel's logic starts with everything Elena said, and so it presupposes formal logic as all the tradition, the metaphysical, the categories of the metaphysical tradition. But for me, a revision, it means that it is in a certain way, Hegel's logic is reducible to formal logic. But if this is so, I need to think of a way to conceive formal logic, where formal logic is not an instrument, but is something like Hegel's paradigm of thought, where I am the instrument of. Sorry, I don't know if I was clear.
Just to comment on contemporary formal logic, Michaela. all formal logic at the moment is conceptualized as done in a fixed language. And it happens to be a formal language, but it's a fixed language. As far as I know, there is no branch of formal logic at the moment about some kind of process for enriching languages. It's clear you have to do this sometimes, but there's no real theory about how you do this in formal logic. Maybe this will come with AI 20 years down the track, but at the moment that's not there.
Can I just say another brief point about the necessity to communicate, which is a point that Elena highlighted. And I totally agree with you, Elena, about this point. I'm completely convinced that the distinction between continental and analytic philosophy is completely outdated. But I always wonder why, if it is really necessary for people who works with an author like Hegel to adequate my language to the analytic philosopher, to the philosophers of the analytic community. I was invited at a workshop where all people were studying formal logic and philosophy of language, and I spoke without using any kind of formal logic instrument. And what I said was completely clear. They criticize me, they make a lot of comments. I think that when we speak in a clear language, we define the notion that we use. We don't need to formalize anything in order to be understandable.
Formal logic is a tool. It has its uses, but it has its limitations. It gives you a symbolism to express things clearly and precisely. You couldn't do mathematics without it. It's just too complicated. So the tools of formal logic have a use when things get very difficult to analyze. But as I say, like any tool, it has its limitations.
For me, it's crucial to confront what I'm working on with the instruments of formal logic, but not trying to reduce my language to the formal logic ones. But most of the time is to start from a basic meaning and try to clear up what is, for example, in Hegel's case, a radical transformation. Of course, I need to have that reference, but this does not imply that I need to reduce my language to another one.
May I quickly have a very short remark on this, because I'm super interested in this question, whether or not we can formalize dialectics. And if that is possible in the course of the next, I don't know, 20, 30 years, then it must be a logic which is capable of self-negation. I mean, this is the very idea of learning processes, no? I mean, if a logic is not just a fixed language, but sort of a context-sensitive learning system, that we might think of this to be formalized. But this brings me then to another point we haven't touched upon so much, but I think for Hegel, this would also require that this system might be embodied. So it must have a body, because it must be directed, it must have desires, it must have a certain idea of the good. So, but this is very speculative thought on what might happen with computational logics. But if it is embodied and capable of self-critique, then it might be formalizable. But I'm not sure if that is helpful. It's just a very quick remark on the question.
I want to say a few words following what Michaela said, and Toby as well. Yeah, I'll put the embodied comment aside. I have objections to that, but I'll just put that aside for a moment. I mean, the one helpful tool, or one, I don't know if the whole language of tools is questionable, so let me put that to the side, okay? But one maybe helpful way of thinking about Hegel's logic conceived formally is to think about formalization of Hegel's logic as a form of Hegelian logic in a kind of Entäußerung, a kind of self-externalized positioning of Hegel's logic, which would not be totally illegitimate, I don't think. In fact, you can't put the formal outside of the logic as some bad other, right? That's the wrong way to think about Hegel's logic. And I think both Stefan and Elena have pointed that out, and I think that's exactly correct. It's not the boogeyman other, we have to just end, you know, but rather it's somehow it has a place, at least I think, at least as the, and this is my own position, the alienated form of dialectical logic, and that it has a necessary and essential place for me as a kind of, as Hegel will say, the abstraction, he'll say, is the soul of the concept, Seele of the concept. So I would even say the formal thinking is in a way the soul, even though it's not sufficient. Without this moment of self-alienation, or as Toby put it, self-negation, you wouldn't have dialectical logics at all. But I do agree with Michaela that it's not sufficient. If you formalized it completely, you would only have, in a way, the shell. You wouldn't have, you would only have the alienated bit, and therefore you wouldn't even have that. I wanted to follow up in less colorful language.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Just one very short on this point. I completely agree with Greg, and I think it is very nicely put to say that for at least the formal logic of Hegel's times is a kind of alienated form of dialectical logic, which so it is very nicely put. I agree with you. It is not incompatible. So there is so formal thinking belongs to it, but it is not all that there is to it. And then the other question is, can dialectics be formalized? Why not? The point is, up to now, I am not really convinced by the, by the formalizations that have been given, but or by those which I know. But why not?
Sorry, I just want to just briefly add something, and then I'll stop. I wanted to follow up again with this theme about transformation or revision, or thinking the presupposition of Verstandeslogik, thinking with Stefan here. One feature of the logic that really attracted me and kind of held my attention is this self-referential predication. Maybe sometimes my description is misleading, but I can give an example of what I mean, and I hope that the example will be less misleading than the term. And I wonder how we're to make of something, what we're to make of something like self-referential predication. Can that be formalized? Is that simply a presupposition of the logic of the understanding, or is the presupposition the logic of the understanding itself not something the logic of understanding can articulate? So this is some of the questions that I have. So take, for example, the logic of the concept. The concept is conceptual. So this is true. The concept as such is conceptual. So not just the concept of being or the concept of quality or quantity, but the concept of the concept. The concept is conceptual. And so that's step one. But then Hegel notes that once you say that, you realize, wait, the concept itself is one of the concepts, right? So you have quality, quantity, being, and you also have the concept. So the concept is conceptual, and that predicate is conceptual, tells you what, distinguishes the concept, marks it out as its distinct notion. So it seems that Hegel has this self-predicative character. The concept is conceptual, and that inevitably leads to a situation in which the concept is its own instance or its own particular. Hegel will talk about self-particularizing as a structure. This is not, the usual way we think about concepts. For example, abstractions. Abstractions, they tell you the common unity of all the instances, but they're not sufficient for their own particularization, right? So it seems that if you have a self-particularizing concept, like for Hegel, one of these for him is the concept Begriff. Then the question is, wait a minute. So we have the logic of the understanding, which we could describe at least in one way as an abstract logic. Doesn't seem to be self-particularizing, and yet this dialectical logic has this self-particularizing character. Is the thinking the presupposition of the logic of understanding, not itself to transcend that logic in a certain way? I don't know, this is maybe a question directed to Stefan as well as to anyone else. I mean,
Well, look, in terms of formal logic, self-reference is everywhere in logic in the 20th century. Okay, it's there are many well-known mechanisms for handling it. Its consequences are contentious. I mean, it's at the root of so many of the paradoxes that have been the life of logic in the 20th century. So that aspect is contentious, but that you can handle self-reference is not contentious at all.
Exactly. So actually, that's a very interesting point that I want to go to next, which is this question of, is the self-referential character of logic? Whereas it seems as though Hegel himself would contrast this with formal logic. Now is, one could say, arguably not as contentious as it once was. Does this invite formalization in a certain way, or is it?
No, I mean, self-reference is an integral part of contemporary formal logic.
That's good. Yeah. So that's in a certain way an invitation to rethink the speculative character of Hegel's logic in formal terms. One thing that I would further ask about is to what extent the self-particularizing feature of Hegel's logic is equally susceptible to formalization. If you have this self-particularizing power that is somehow at the source of, self-predicative power that's at the source of self-particularization, I'm curious to what extent self-particularization, this language of self-particularization.
Okay, so they're concepts which apply to themselves, and it's easy enough to represent these in a formal language. Often they give rise to paradox, unless you take sort of precautions to deliberately stop this. But the natural result of this thing is paradox, and I don't think that's contentious amongst formal logicians.
Thanks, Stefan. Yeah. Oh, you're muted.
You're muted, Stefan.
Sorry, so I would just say that self-reference, I think it's still a little bit, let's say, undetermined, because we can have two problems. So the problem of self-reference we already find in Plato and his ideas. So is the idea of one itself one? And he really makes it explicit, and Hegel was very fond of this dialogue in the Sophistes, where he says, okay, the idea of identity partakes in the idea of difference, in the idea of being, and so on. But I think there is an important difference between Hegel and Plato, because in Plato you can say, okay, we still, with the ideas, we still have this distinction between the content of the idea and the form of the idea as an idea. So this is how Gadamer, I think, and his reflections on antique philosophy are great. He says, oh yes, this is so the solution to the problem of dialectics in the Sophistes. Just say, okay, the content of identity is simply identity. So what the idea of identity says is identity. But as an idea, and we could say as a concept, it also partakes in the idea of difference. And I think here's the problem with Gadamer. He says, oh, and the same happens with Hegel's dialectics. And Wolfgang Wieland, I think he was a student of Gadamer, at least he was also in Heidelberg. He accepts this interpretation of Gadamer, and I think his interpretation of the logic and how it evolves really strongly relies on this form-content distinction. But I think, Greg, you would agree with me that Hegel does not make this form-content distinction. Yeah. So I don't really have a good solution, but at least I think we must see that for Hegel, the problem of self-reference occurs in a stronger sense than for Plato or somebody else who can still say, okay, we have a concept, and of course the concept of concept is itself a concept. And I think this idea of self-particularization is meant to be that it's not like we have like a selection of concepts, and look, the concept of concept. Also,
okay. I don't want to be a killjoy, but formal logic has gone a long way since Plato. It's gone a long way since Hegel. Okay. The techniques of modern formal logic are much more powerful than anything either Plato or Hegel dreamt of.
I think this is not my issue. This is nice for the logicians or good for them, but I think you still have to make the distinction. What do you mean by self-reference? Do you mean that self-reference is as in Plato, that you say, oh, as a being, for example, or as a notion, the notion of one is also one because it's not two notions?
Yeah. We know how to handle. Sure, we know how to handle that in terms of formal logic. I mean, Plato in the Parmenides, I mean, the third man argument is a prime instance of self-reference, okay? And there are many accounts of that using the techniques of modern formal logic. I mean, how you do this is to a certain extent contentious, but that the techniques are there is not contentious.
Yeah,
Toby.
I really appreciate these. It's very insightful what you're talking about, because I like this idea of the self-reference as a core problem, which is visible in logics, but also visible in Hegel, because in Hegel we find a place for this. There is a place for the first stage of dialectics, and this is the analytics. So the first step is self-referentiality. So we kind of abstract from the object of thought, from its related character, just look at the thought. So this is what we do when it comes to the first step of the logic of the doctrine. So the concept as such. But this is, I think, what Stefan, this is textual evidence for your heretic idea that Hegel kind of says that in the first step, the analysis is always said more than the analysis is aiming at. So it's implying more. The very idea of self-referentiality is empty. So we need to proceed, and this is what happens in syntheses. And I think this is, we've got these problems of self-referentiality and then the relatedness of everything, how to formalize this. This brings us to the idea of syntheses. And I think this is extremely helpful, at least from my point of view, that we have to reject this talk on thesis and antithesis, because this is not what happens. It's not that we have a thesis of being and then we have an antithesis of nothing, and a new concept would generate out of this. It's rather that we've got a certain analysis of a concept, and we see that this is an abstract analysis because we leave something extremely important out of this, because the connectedness of that very object. So we proceed in this relation, and this is what happens. So it's kind of false to think of the analysis to be the entire project, but this is a different rhythm, a different pattern, a different score than what we find so often as the reconstruction of Hegel dialectics. So I think this is what we can see here when we speak about the idea of self-referential character, because this is kind of the first step. And this brings me or this is connected from my point of view to this question we touched upon last week, because I'm not that sure, I must say, that the idea of self-particularization is everything we have to tell about the story, because the idea of the Wechselwirkung is also very important. So I don't think that totality, the empirical totality, is generated out of the concept. And I think this is the wrong understanding of idealism. So there is this idea of the synthesis, the connectedness is very important. So there is only such a thing as self-particularization through its relation to its others. So it's not an either or that we have self-particularization or Wechselwirkung. But I would think that self-particularization is a moment of this related character of the thought. So the other of the concept, the object, is how the concept is particularizing itself, and this is what we then see in the last step of dialectics. So, but I'm rather critical. But I'm critical of this entire tradition of the autonomous negation, as Henrich calls this, which leads then to self-particularization. I think the idea of Wechselwirkung is much more central to the movement of the concept.
Yeah, Toby, I want to maybe comment on two things. One, what comment that you made, and then back to this question of self-referential predication, and then what I've called existential implication, self-particularization. So first, you had this nice quote that you posted about the Wechselwirkung, the substances gives rise to the concept. And I think that's right. And in that respect, Wechselwirkung is a categorical development that gives rise to the concept. I think that's exactly right. And it's textually grounded and everything. But of course, it is giving rise to a new kind of, to the concept of the concept. And we're canceling and preserving substance. So there's a question about the extent to which your Wechselwirkung will have application And it will, but the question is whether it will be sufficient to elucidate what the concept is, or whether there will be something additional that will need to come into play to articulate what conceptual development as such will be. So I just put that to the side as a question, right? But to come back to this question of self-reference and self-particularization, and what Stefan noted about the Parmenides. Yeah, I mean, so Hegel solves the third man problem, I think, right? So we have the third man problem, and Hegel solves the problem. Turns out not to be a problem in the end, actually. The true infinite, in a way, generates this bad infinity. And so I think Hegel, of course, as Graham pointed out, Hegel is very fond of Parmenides and inspired by it in many ways. Plato is a forerunner to the dialectics, but Hegel's dialectics is, of course, in a way designed specifically, I would say, to solve this third man regress, one of the forms of which is articulated as a problem or paradox, at least in the Parmenides of self-reference, right? At least this is how I would read it. And I'll just make one more comment and then you can respond, which is that, of course, I totally agree and take Graham's word. And we've had a lot of these conversations, especially also with Marcus, about these issues of self-containment, right? But I think what's interesting about Hegel, at least in some of the parts of the logic, is that he'll use self-referential predication and self-particularization as a way to argue for, at least on my reading, dialetheism, as a way of trying to establish the truth of contradiction, which I know is not obvious and evident from a purely formal point of view, right? And so one will have to look at particular cases of self-reference and cases in which the whole is an element of itself to decide whether it is the case that you have a contradiction at any particular point. And take, for example, this concept of the concept. I think in this case, the self-referential predication does in fact generate a true contradiction, because you have both the very same concept being universal and particular. The concept as such is the universal, and it is also particular. So I would argue that at least in this case, we have a way of using self-referential predication and self-particularization to generate a dialetha, even though maybe in every case that won't be the case. So I just wanted to kind of, this question about the formalization of logic, whether Hegel's logic can be formalized as we understand it in the 20th century. We have to, I think, probably think about all of these advances in formal logic, as Graham has been pointing out, and not just think about formal logic in Hegel's terms. If we're going to be thinking about, the potential of Hegel in the 21st century, I think that's something that's very important for us. Sorry, I didn't mean to go on forever. Stefan, you
just wanted to ask, yeah. Why is the third man problem? It doesn't seem to be the problem of self-reference. I mean, the third man problem occurs for Aristotle because Plato allegedly, according to Aristotle, says, okay, the idea is that which is connecting, the idea of man is that which is connecting you, me, and so on and so on. And then Aristotle says, oh yes, but if the idea of man is that which connects you, Graham, Toby, and me, and so on, then we need another idea, namely, which connects us to the idea of man. And I think Hegel here, I think he's more the quotation that Toby gave from Hegel. Here you can see that substance for him is what Aristotle called the tn einai, that what is that which is, and that why the thing which is what it is.
Actually,
so I think he never has this third man problem.
I think actually Aristotle's critique of Plato is already Plato's critique of himself. I mean, Aristotle's third man argument is just lifted right out of Plato's Parmenides.
No. But here you can see, but a lot of Plato scholars would say that the Parmenides is written after the first critiques of Aristotle, so it's already a reply to. Okay,
so there is that question. That's a legitimate question. Okay, so I'm going to put that to the side here, right? Whether it's Plato responding to Aristotle or Aristotle repeating something Plato said. I mean, you can formulate third man regress in terms of self-reference, and that's how one of the ways Plato does it there, right? He says greatness is great. Greatness is one of the great things. So all great things participate in greatness. Greatness is itself great. So greatness is one of the great things. And when greatness is one of the great things, it can't be the form of greatness. And so there must be another form of greatness that greatness participates in. And then Parmenides says you have an infinite series of forms, right? And so then, old Parmenides says, oh, young Socrates. And the beautiful thing here, right, is Socrates is young, right? He's young Socrates. He really isn't the old man yet, right? So old Parmenides says, only I forget exactly what he says, but basically only someone like a genius can solve this problem, and they need to make dialogue possible, right? To make communication possible, to think of Toby here, right? So I think at least, in some way it's Plato's problem, even if it's a response to Aristotle. And it's one of the formulations of third man is explicitly put in terms of self-reference that generates that infinite regress of forms, an infinite number of the forms of greatness, And of course, Aristotle's solution is to say that the form and the material the form itself is not an element of the thing, right? So if you make the form into an element of the thing, then you'll have form of form of form and form. Aristotle simply denies self-reference because he thinks basically you're going to get into that third man regress. And actually part of the insight of, as Graham's pointing out, is you don't need to make that move that Aristotle does to solve Plato's problem. You don't have to deny the self-referential predication to solve Plato's problem. That's also Hegel's genius too. And that's why Aristotle's on the wrong side of things here, I think.
We don't have long left. Are there any questions on Facebook?
Let's take a look. It doesn't look like we have any questions right now, so.
I just
maybe
wanted
some will come next week.
Go on,
just one correction, because Michela said, Ellen, I completely agree with you. The analytic continental distinction is completely outdated. I do not think that it is outdated. I think it is still a problem. We haven't solved yet.
Can dialetheism, this kind of discourse, help us solve it? I mean, this kind of seminar help us solve?
Absolutely, yes.
It's that's, really important.
That's the very scope of the seminar. Yes.
Yeah.
Can I ask a couple of questions? Quick question.
Go for it.
Yep. Toby, just a clarification question. You were mentioning Wechselwirkung. I don't know the English word for it. It's reciprocal causality, something like that. You're muted.
Yeah.
You're muted, Toby.
Sorry. Reciprocal affection is this term of is translated by Di Giovanni.
Okay. I don't see. I didn't understand the necessity to go to Wechselwirkung. Since I was thinking about Wechselwirkung as the very dialectic that leads us to the particularization of the concept. So I see Wechselwirkung and the particularization of the universality of the concept as two steps of the same process. But I don't know if I am right. And Greg, what kind of relation you see between this self-predicative structure of logical determination and Hegel's claim of the insufficiency of the predicative structure of judgment in order to express speculative truth? And last point, yes, Elena, you're right. You are right, but we are of course, we are working. We are trying to work in a different direction. So I completely agree with you.
Toby, did you want to answer the first, and then?
I'm thankful for this kind of. I would think this to be some sort of an affirmation, because I do think that Wechselwirkung or reciprocal or reciprocity, and self-particularization, they go hand in hand. So we don't have neither or. So it's just that I see in the secondary literature too much, I must say, too much of stressing the idea of the autonomous negating of the part of the concept. So it's too much of self-particularization, as if the objectivity would just be a result of the movement of the concept as such. But the object it's an other of the concept. So it needs a kind of an object which shows a certain resistance to the thought. So as if thinking would just be unfolding of its own implications, but it's a work. We have to submit to the objectivity in its complexity, in its ambiguousness, in its ambiguity. So the idea of the contradiction not to be a flaw, is to, from my point of view, says very clearly that objectivity is complex matter. It's entangled, it's complex. We cannot just easily use our schemas and like bring in the empirical content in our schemas. We have to, it's work. So in this sense, the self-particularization is dependent on the communication between subjectivity and objectivity. And this is to say that they go hand in hand, or sides of the same coin. But I think in the interpretation of Hegel, we have to, stress the other aspect, the non-self-relational referential point. And but I mean, in the end of the day, it's something which we have to bring together.
Yeah, I'll be brief since we're running out of time. I tend to take the opposite position, the one that Toby just mentioned. I think I tend to see the concept as sufficient for its own realization. There's a place where Hegel says the concept is the sole principle of truth. So I tend to think along these lines. Probably a radicalization of the view that Toby's seeing in the literature, maybe. But it's an interesting conversation. It's a great question you asked about self-predication, though, because it's maybe a bit misleading, the way that I use the term, right? Because predicative structure, such as the structure of judgments, like you point out, fails to somehow articulate the speculative, right? S is P, doesn't articulate that S is not P. It somehow covers over this unity, right? So speculative truth can't really be articulated, according to Hegel, in form of judgment. So that's right. So maybe a better way to describe this would be something like the self-reflexive, thinking that's self-reflexive, or that is reflectively applying to itself. And using terms like this would avoid importing determinations, maybe from judgment or propositional determinations, that make it appear as though what we're doing is trying to articulate dialectical thinking in terms of something that can't really express it or articulate it. But for me, it's a way of communicating that is, I think, clearer, and that one can, even if, in the spirit of Elena's comments, that communication can obfuscate other dimensions, and so one has to qualify oneself carefully, right? So I appreciate the question and the problem. Reading Hegel, thinking Hegel, communicating Hegel. These are the three horsemen. I don't know how many horsemen of the apocalypse there are, but it's difficult.
Nowadays, 73, Greg.
Oh, 73? Okay, how many of them?
And rising.
Okay.
Stefan, we're nearly out of time. Why don't you have the last word?
Oh, you're muted.
I just wanted to ask you, Graham, because I'm really interested in it. So if you talk about self-reference in modern formal logic, so isn't I only know the medieval terms, they would call it suppositio materialis, as distinct from suppositio personalis.
Suppositio materialis is when you use a word to refer to itself. It's a form of rough self-reference. But I mean, self-reference goes a long way beyond that in modern logic. I mean, it's at the root of Gödel's incompleteness theorems, the halting theorems, and so many famous theorems of 20th century logic. So it goes a long way beyond material supposition.
But doesn't it always? So, but you would say this always ends in, or many times ends in a paradox, and so that's why we need the logic of paradox, or? Well,
look, self-reference can end in paradox. It doesn't have to end in paradox.
Mhm.
And there's a question of when it does, and there's a question of what you do when it does and how to handle it. And that's been a running theme of 20th century logic.
Well, it is 10 o'clock, and this is the end. So I hope that we don't. Should we have some final comments? Elena, do you want to say anything before we go?
Just wanted to thank you, and it was very nice to meet you weekly, and to have the occasion to see each other, even if we are living in different planetary spheres. And it was, I really enjoyed this last meeting. I liked that everyone had 5 minutes to talk and to say something about the question, the main question, why Hegel and Dialetheism. It was very interesting to listen to the different approaches, to listen about Geltung und Genese, and the idea of Geltung achieved through critical appropriation of Genesis by Toby. It was great to listen about the idea of contradiction, of true contradictions, as the very vocation of philosophy, as Greg stated, and also as the very topic of philosophy. And then it was very stimulating to hear all the talks we have had. So thanks.
Yeah, and I just want to say briefly before we go, thanks again, as Elena said, to everybody, those of you who are here with us now and those who have presented but can't be with us. I think it was especially important that we have these kind of seminars and dialogues, especially in the time of COVID, when many of us are not able to travel to join conferences and to engage in person. It doesn't replace it, but it is better than nothing. And we can, thanks to technology, actually, in this case, we can actually have some semblance of what we would have had in person. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming week after week. It was quite a time commitment, and thanks for coming and contributing, and I learned a lot from everybody. I hope we can keep talking about it on our own.
I'm sure we will.
Okay. Any final
Shall we continue with these sorts of online colloquiums? Because for me, it would be great to have this kind of platform on the global scale.
Let's keep our mind open. I'm not ready to commit to anything yet. It's a busy semester ahead. Yeah.
Openness.
Okay.
Well, stay safe, everybody,
Thank you.
and I'm sure our paths will cross again in due course.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye. All the best. Stay safe.